All right. So this is Robert Sin with Goldfinger Capital at CEO Technician on X, at Goldfinger on CEO.ca. And I'm with Michael Gunning of VR Resources and Justin Daley. Mike is the CEO and Justin is the VP of Exploration. How are you guys doing today?
Doing good.
It's fine, Robert. Thanks for the time this morning. I should say this afternoon for you.
Yes. Yeah, this is Wednesday, May 29th, 2024. It's afternoon on the East Coast. So, a little context, VR is a company that I've followed since roughly February of this year. I've known about it for a couple of years, but I got a lot more interested because of the new Boston project, which is the one we'll be talking about today, and a project which I visited last month in the Walker Lane Trend near the town of Luning. When I was on site, VR was drilling hole 001 of this program. And last week, VR put out some news about hole 1. We're going to get into that. But first, I want to ask, how's hole 2 going? Because I know that you said you've just started hole 2 and just sort of interested to see how that hole's coming along.
Sure, Robert, I can start. I'm in the office in Vancouver. Justin is just out of the field for a break in Nevada. The idea with hole 2, well, first of all, it's going well. And one of the benefits that we have is that exploration, including drilling, is a learning curve. And we're taking the learning curve from essentially broken ground in hole 1, which was there from top to bottom, and how we can modify our drilling approach, the steel that we're using, the diameter of the pipes. And so the drillers on hole 2 know what they're getting into based on hole 1. So that's positive. The production, daily production, is already better than it was in hole 1. Having said that, there is a video on our project page, drilling in Nevada in the Walker Lane with what we call tertiary extension and vertical tectonics. It accentuates, Robert, the amount of broken ground in anything that is above the valley bottoms. And so Justin and I have to accept that while we may produce 70 meters on a drill ship on our rare earth element and kimberlite discoveries in Ontario, in the good old Canadian Shield in the Superior Province, we're not going to get that in Nevada. We're not going to get that on hole 2. But is it going better? It is. And I think it's also going to give Justin and I the ability to see different things than what we saw in hole 1, to build the picture for exploration at New Boston. We are drilling geophysical anomalies from the state-of-the-art IP, that's true. But really, this is an integrated target to look at the role of stratigraphy and beds that like the mineralization, they're receptive to it, the role of structure and these corridors and these conduits for fluid that formed before the intrusion came in. And then lastly, the intrusions themselves, their sills, their dikes, their vertical stocks. We got a better feel for them, Robert. In the first hole, we could actually see multiple porphyry phases. And so hole 2 is going to give us a different look at how these 3 controlling factors are working with the hydrothermal fluids. And that's going to be a big benefit for us and this program.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit more detail, hole 1 was right about this area here. Hole 2 is on the other side of this hill. We started hole 1. I wasn't expecting a ton of this clay alteration. Obviously, there's a big mountain in behind where the drill was situated, so I figured there's probably some hard rocks holding all that up. Turns out basin and range tectonics had a pretty large impact. There are a number of late tertiary epithermal gold deposits around the area, which are, of course, caused by that basin and range tectonics. So we're seeing influences of things like that in our own drilling now, overprinting in a weak way on top of the porphyry system that we've observed. So going into hole 2, we decided to start in PQ for as long as we possibly can to make sure we can get that hole into our target depths without too much trouble. Now that we know what's happening to the different stratigraphic lithologies and how they react to the different alteration, we can sort of plan ahead for you know, what happens when the torque gets really high on the drill, what additives to use, how hard to press and things like that. So we're learning as we go. A couple holes were drilled in 2011. I spoke with a project geologist from that program. All their holes were vertical, so they weren't having as many of these issues. Our holes are inclined to make sure we get under and into the heart of the system. And past that, everybody from the 1960s and 70s programs are passed away, or at this point, they don't remember what happened. So we're learning as we go, and it's going better on this drill hole.
Okay, great. So hole one, you put out news on hole one. So far, the market is acting like it was not good news, but let's dig into hole one and how to interpret this properly. You guys said a lot of things right there. One thing that caught my attention is host rocks, like the porphyry intruded, it injected fluids, copper-bearing sulfides, moly-bearing sulfides. What did you learn from hole one? What have you learned so far? Obviously, the assays are pending. You know, what's your current interpretation? Is the limestone actually a favorable host for the porphyry, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we learned on hole one, obviously near surface, we're seeing a little bit more of that limestone host rock, and in that we do see skarns, small skarn zones where the porphyry sills are kind of injecting up into the layered limestone rock. I'll just share my screen quickly to show one of the photos from the news release. And wrong one. Sorry about that. So these rocks right here, this is the gaussons that we see at surface. Those deep red hematite gaussons, which I believe we saw from our field trip visit. You can see them around the drill pad, and this is where we see some interesting mineralization, the oxidation of some of those skarn features. We believe that were sulfides in there primarily, including chalcopyrite. So it is a good host for mineralization. But the most important thing that we learned in that drill program were the two different phases of porphyries in the system. Right from, you know, the collar down through about 300 meters, we saw one phase of porphyry. Very strong A veining, which is early hot quartz veining in a porphyry system with disseminated sulfides all along the selvages of those veins and disseminated through the rock. And then there was a second phase of porphyry deeper in the hole, as well as a third porphyritic phase that seemed to be more susceptible to some of this basin and range tectonics and hydrothermal activity. But in any case, several different phases of porphyry, which is exactly what you want to see in a large dynamic system. The more porphyry phases you have, the more mineralization events that you have, and the better your chances are of finding something truly large. So we're encouraged by seeing these porphyry phases, and this is what we're targeting, and finding the source of these porphyry phases at depth with hole 2.
Okay,
I think
so
I was just going to add to Justin's comment that the other thing that is good to see, if you're out in the field with any global porphyry expert, you want to see the polyphase porphyry phases that Justin is talking about. What you also want to see is quartz veining. And that quartz-rich fluid, which is going to carry the sulfide, is evolving with these multiple porphyry phases. And Robert, if you remember on our field trip, we talked about wanting to see the intensity of multi-phase quartz veins in stockworks that you can see in select outcrops in the East Zone Bowl. And the photos that we put in the news release are there just to convey that it's important for us in a 600-meter hole to remind ourselves and to, in that update, show that we're seeing that kind of abundance and intensity of not just quartz veining, but actual stockwork geometries. And it's really important for how you build polymetallic grade in these systems, is with not just multiple phases of porphyries, but with that kind of intensity of quartz veining.
So when you look at this core, and this question is for both of you, what are you seeing? Where are the copper sulfides? Where is the moly? I mean, you said, yeah, the copper sulfides come up through the veins. In this porphyry system, have the copper sulfides been injected into the host rock, or are they still largely just in the quartz veins?
They're disseminated through the rock. It's in the oxide zone in the top 300 meters of the hole. It's difficult to see because all those sulfides are oxidizing away. But typically all these blackish spots along the edges of veins are where the sulfides were. A lot of these are called manganese oxides, pyrolusite. It's one of the things that sort of weathers out of these rocks, or out of these sulfides. So in the top half of the hole, it's anybody's guess. Really, you can differentiate between, not to get too technical, but like girthite and glassy limonite and things like that. But with the multiple, the sort of overprint of a later weak hydrothermal system, some of that is a little bit harder to tell. And then in the deeper parts of the hole, we're seeing pyrite, chalcopyrite, and molybdenum disseminated throughout the rock, as well as along the edges of veins, and more or less seeing the same thing as we're showing these two pictures throughout the drill hole. There was no sort of real pause in intensity of veining or intensity of sulfide. So what we saw is what we saw for really the full length of the hole. And then at the point we got to around 600 meters, it was just getting towards diminishing returns on production. So we decided to move to hole 2 just for discipline on the drill program. But overall, we saw a continuous amount of veining the whole length of the hole.
And then I think the other thing that the hole confirmed, if you go to, I think it's figure 2, photo 2, Justin, is what Justin's already alluded to, is when those porphyry phases come into contact with the limestone, Robert. The limestone obviously is calcareous. It's extremely reactive to these acidic fluids that are forming these quartz veins with sulfide. And everything that Justin is talking about is amplified because you're not just having disseminated sulfide in the porphyry and a vein in the porphyry that's forming in a crack, but you're actually able to dissolve and replace the limestone with sulfide, which in this case, in this photo, is primarily been transformed to oxide.
Yeah,
but
you can see one of those quartz
seeing,
veins up
yes,
here with that strong replacement on the edges of it, and going into the limestone that is also almost entirely replaced.
Does the fluid at New Boston, is it chemically robust and fertile with sulfide such that when it hits a limestone contact, it goes into what I would call seek and destroy mode? And you can see that in the field in the East Zone Bowl, in those deep maroon color anomalies. And it's good to see it in drill core. That is it's telling you about the nature of the fluid that is associated with these porphyry phases. So it's very encouraging to see this in drill core or hundreds of meters below where we can see it on surface in those color anomaly Gaussons in the bowl.
So, I'm looking at this, and what I'm hearing you say is that at one point in time, these rocks were shot full of copper sulfides, and there was probably a lot of chalcopyrite and maybe even some chalcocite in there, but it has been oxidized, it has been exposed to the elements, and some of it has leached out. So while there may still be some copper in these cores, it's not going to be nearly as rich as it was when it was first injected. Is that correct?
I would say, so this is something we've been thinking about and talking about, the difference between porphyries in Nevada and BC, say, with Arizona and Chile in the Atacama Desert. When you're in a truly dry, hot area for a long period of time, any amount of water is going to strip the copper sulfides out of the rock what I believe we're seeing here in Nevada porphyry systems, as well as systems all the way up through, Montana, Idaho, and BC, is a lot of the copper is actually staying in situ. It's not moving around too much, and especially with the acidic, or sorry, the limestone. It's basic. It's much more reactive. So that acidic fluid dropping down through the rock that you would typically think about in Arizona or the Atacama, it's not happening in this particular spot because it would just stop on that limestone. It's not going to go much further than that. It buffers out. So whatever we're seeing, I believe we're seeing more or less in situ. Yeah.
Maybe, Justin, we can segue to, if you can pull up the 3D cross-section in the oblique model in the corporate deck. And so one of the vectors, page 25, one of the vectors that we do want to talk about, Robert, in terms of that fluid migration, is what's happening in the limestone as one of our vectors, which is copper, moly, and silver-bearing fluids moving away from the driving porphyry intrusions and literally traveling up to the bedding contacts, the bedding seams in the limestone. And so you can see to the south of the drill, up on the hillside of the CCT zone, there are copper workings, and it's called CCT because there is chalcopyrite, chalcocite in the limestone.
And that was one of the pieces that you grabbed when you're up there.
Yeah, that migration's important. That's one of your really key vectors, Robert, for mineralization is looking at what happens when this evolving porphyry system with quartz veins comes into the limestone. And one of the things that happens is that the fluids move out in the limestone stratigraphy. And that is an important fluid migration component of the system. And that's one of the vectors that we want to try and understand, because not every limestone bed is as receptive to precipitating copper from that fluid, or moly, or silver, as the next. And that's why you can see on this cross section, on the very left-hand side, the layer below the volcanic layer is almost acting like an aquitard. And so most of the reactivity is happening in that CCT unit. Understanding that fluid migration in that stratigraphy will allow you to try and follow those fluids back to source. And the idea being, Robert, that the closer you are to source, the more proximal you are to source, the better chance you have of seeing the best grade of mineralization in the system. In other words, the farther you get away on the migration path, the lower your concentration of metal is likely going to be.
Yeah, so some of these blowout veins that we walked up to on your visit, you do see minerals like tetrahedrite, which is a silver-rich sulfur salt, and that's something that is found more distal. So that sort of leads into this story of you zones, and then you vector your way into the copper-rich zones. So silver plus copper up here. Some of that tetrahedrite and chalcopyrite is very locally degrading and upgrading to chalcocite in these specific areas. But that chalcocite is almost existing exactly where the precursor mineral was. So whenever you see something like that, it's not too far away from that initial mineral. And then to Mike's point, we'd expect going down into this layer here, that the closer you get to those porphyry sources where these different porphyry phases are originating, things are going to get stronger and more interesting.
When you see tetrahedrite, you're usually near the top of the porphyry system, is that correct?
Yeah, you're outside and up, which is the case here at CCT. You're good like 800 meters. Let's see. Yeah, that looks about 600-700 meters from where we're drilling hole 1 and where the GW structure intersects with what we think is a controlling structure at depth. So you're a good ways away here, and probably if you're thinking about down dip, you're over a kilometer. So those fluids have moved quite a ways, and they're still carrying the copper. By the time they get out here, there's more silver than there is copper. You get minerals like tetrahedrite and tennantite. make some beautiful little sort of tetragonal diamond shapes in the rock. And then as you get closer and closer in, you see more of the chalcopyrite and things like that.
So with hole 2, what is the question that you're trying to answer?
Let me just, Justin, we can stay on this figure. You can see the east-west structure that we're putting on this cross section. And that's a vertical structure that's going into the bowl on Justin's screen behind him. So that's an example, Robert, of a straight structural control for fluid. And hole 1 was really biased towards answering the question, what is going on that structure? As it turns out, it's pretty clearly controlling the emplacement of multiple porphyry phases, which is a good thing. The second hole, what we want to learn, what we're going to try and learn more of, is what's going on this dipping limestone package. And you can't quite see it on any specific figure, but schematically, we would say Justin and I are going to get a better handle on what's going on in the receptive limestone layer, the dipping unit from the top left to the bottom right, and its influence on these quartz veins with copper. Because this drill hole is going to spend most of its time in this layer. And so it's going to give us a better look at what's going on in the limestone as it's interacting with these porphyry intrusions.
Yeah, and ultimately to find out where those fluids are coming from, the things that we're seeing at surface, the south end of the east zone bowl, sort of off this side of my photo here. We spent a bit of time over there, and the idea is to find out where all that is coming from. And of course, the model is that it's coming up dip, so let's go down dip to find the ultimate source of those fluids. And the thing with porphyry systems is again, there's multiple phases of these intrusions. And if you're paying attention to the core, you can see different vein relationships. Some veins are associated with specific intrusions. And when you can find the sort of cross-cutting relationships and what metals are in which veins, then you really start to unlock where that fluid is ultimately coming from. What is the host or the intrusion for your best chance at a metal intersection?
Okay, and you said in last week's news that you're open to going deeper in hole 2. Is that still your thinking? And what will prompt you to go deeper? Like if you see something, what is that going to tell you? And how deep might this hole go?
Go ahead, Justin.
Well, we're starting more or less here on this section, and the idea is to drill down and across the east zone bowl where we see at surface in this photo behind me, where a lot of that fluid is sort of rising vertically. If we can see what that looks like at depth, and then if it gets more interesting in terms of like, is there another porphyry phase, or is there that intrusion that I feel like is really shooting these fluids up and through the early porphyry phases, you would get into something called the cupola zone, which is like this sort of outer rind of your mineralizing porphyry. And that would be exciting. Getting into high grade skarn would be exciting. Any number of exciting things can happen when you get deep into a porphyry system, when you find the roots of where these high level fluids up here at the CCT zone and exposed in the east zone bowl behind me here, where is that coming from? And that's essentially what we're looking for. And again, to Mike's point, this east-west structure, we kind of drilled parallel to it in the first hole, and it would be interesting to see, say, around 800-900 meters to 1,000 meters depth as we cross that main controlling structure, what happens as you cross that structure. So if we see encouraging things getting closer and closer to it, then we're obviously going to just stay in it while we're there. Not very often you get to drill 1,000-meter hole.
Think of it, Robert, as convergence of vectors, convergence of influence on fluid flow. And if you have a convergence of vectors, you might be able to just increase your fluid flow. So yeah, Justin, I was thinking of going to page 22. But on that cross-section, imagine what could be happening when that stratigraphic fluid flow vector converges with that east-west structural fluid vector. And that's where, if you're seeing in this drill hole that the veining in the limestone is becoming more and more intense as we progress towards that east-west structure, that's when we talk about being open to letting this hole go further. And you can sort of see it, Justin, on page 22 on the radiometric map with the mag, where we are drilling down towards the bowl in hole 2. We're drilling towards that east-west magnetic lineament, which is basically our east-west structure. So what's happening with your stratigraphic conduit when it runs into that structural conduit?
Yep.
And that's where this hole, we think, is going to show us something different, something in addition to what we saw in hole 1, which was clearly multiple porphyry phases in quartz veining moving in along that east-west structure. That is our big learning curve for hole 1.
Yeah, and you can see again what Mike just mentioned, this east-west structure, bit of a west-northwest element to it, trending through here. So there's a couple different things happening in this particular zone, including a magnetic high, a very subtle one, because you've got a lot of limestone sitting on top of something that might be at depth. And this magnetic high just happens to be at the confluence of this west-northwest structure that you can see controlling things on this relative conductor here. And there's the one underneath the Jeep mine zone. So there's this common thread across the property. That's that more structure we're talking about. The GW structure, which we mapped last summer, which has some of the highest grade veins on the property outcropping right here in this area. So if you move along these sort of northerly trends like this, these west-northwest trends like this, and you have a hole starting more or less right here, by the time we're around 700-800 meters, we're going to be passing through this zone. And that's where, when we say that we're open to this hole going deeper, it's because we're targeting this particular feature at depth, and doing it in a way that's a little bit easier than going up on top of the mountain that you can see behind me here in this photo, and drilling a vertical hole down. So testing a bunch of different fluid pathways from the top of the hole all the way down to what we feel might be the root of the system.
One thing I could add, Robert, I've had a few people talk to me, Justin, if we can flip to page 22. What you learn when you see potassic alteration at surface in drill core, here where the base map is a potassium over thorium ratio to show you potassium intensity that's been introduced by hydrothermal activity from our airborne survey in 2022, I think. And people had noted that in the Hercules project, that's one of the vectors that they're using is, when do we start to see the evidence for potassic alteration? That tends to be when you're in the region of the high temperature core of the system, where you expect to see copper precipitation. And you can see in hole 2, based on looking at potassic alteration in the field and in the airborne survey, that this hole is going to show us a transect or an intersection where we have the most evidence for a fluid pathway, a vector in the limestone, where there's good evidence for high temperature potassic alteration. And that is where you want to be to see where the veins are going to be carrying potentially the most copper, because they're the highest temperature veins.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. The conductivity. So when you guys were getting ready for this program, there was a lot of talk about the conductivity that you were seeing there in the hole 1 target. What have you learned from hole 1 about what the conductivity is actually showing you? And are there any other targets? Like I noticed there's an area a little bit to the northeast that is sort of a magnetic, anomaly that looks like it could be interesting. Is that something that you're, at all intrigued by?
Are you talking about these sort of things up here.
I can't see your, oh, show me again.
There's a magnetic anomaly up here. There's another one here. They're quite subtle, so it'd be and I'd imagine they're relatively deep.
Okay.
So at this stage in the drilling, we're starting where we can see mineralization to reduce some of the risk for the drill program and trying to follow it into where we think things are coming from. I would love to follow up with holes in these areas eventually to see what's at depth there. Especially in a porphyry system, there's that sort of classic donut anomaly that you want to look for, or any sort of circular anomaly as an inevitable source of where the porphyry system is. But as far as conductance, this is the East Zone conductor that we drilled through. It's roughly less than 50 ohm meters. So relative to conductor compared to the marble in limestone that's relatively unmineralized outside of the system, where you're well over 500, 1,000, 2,000 ohm meters, very resistive rocks. And I would say that what we're seeing in the East Zone conductor are it's just the quartz veins with sulfide on them. And that's our conductor. We spend the entire hole in stockwork vein porphyry with
I
sulfide.
think if you showed that photo, Justin, from photo 1 in the news release, where you have crossing stockwork quartz veins with those black specks being oxidized sulfide on the vein margins, that rock will pass a current. There's enough interconnectedness of quartz veins with sulfide that I think, in our view, we're seeing evidence that the DIA survey is working in terms of mapping conductivity, in contrast to, as Justin said, essentially unmineralized dead resistor limestone.
And all of this is above the water table, so we're not really thinking about that as an influence. Like when you think about the water table here is probably roughly around this point here in the hole. So we're seeing most of the conductance above water, which right. Makes sense to us. But yeah, essentially we've learned that the conductor here is a stockwork vein porphyry, 2 porphyry phases.
Okay. You know, it's interesting being there at the project, talking to you guys in person, seeing it with my own eyes, talking to you again now on a Zoom call. It adds important context, and I understand what's going on and what you guys are doing, and it's a process, and it's steady. It may not be as fast as some people want it to be, but you guys are one step at a time. You're making progress.
Yeah.
And I think this project is very, very much alive. And quite frankly, it's unrealistic to make a new discovery at the first hole of a program. I think it's happened like once in a million. So I feel like you guys are well on your way here. And I'd just be interested to see more holes, you know, and obviously that takes time and money. So just to wrap it up, put a bow tie on the conversation, and always a tough question to ask a junior mining CEO, but I'm going to ask you, Mike, because you know, you're a big guy. When will you update investors again? I mean, obviously, will you communicate after hole 2 is completed, or will you maybe even speak to us sooner?
I think the default would be that we would give an update, completion of hole 2, completion of the program, when we expect to receive results. Again, on a normal program in the good old Superior Shield in Northern Canada, the updates can be more timely just because you're getting more drill production. So I think, Robert, the simple answer would be, I would anticipate putting out an update when we're at a next threshold, completion of the hole, completion of the overall meters that we wanted to complete for this program, which is plus or minus 1,500. And that I see as the next sort of threshold, if you will.
Okay. And you know, while I have you here, let me throw one more at you. This is a conversation that we had the day I was at the project. And just sort of like, what is the threshold that you guys are thinking in terms of scale and grade? Now you've got three metals here. You've got copper, you've got moly, you have silver, the three main key aspects of the project. What's the threshold that you're thinking, like, we need to see these grades at minimum to have this project move forward to a later stage?
I can let Justin dive into that, but I think in general, Robert, when you look at what's going on with the price of copper as it relates to the push in sustainable technologies and the green economy and AI and server farms for that matter, and big data, in concert with the discovery lag in copper over the last 25 to 30 years, and the push for not just new discoveries, but new copper mines. In Western North America, it's probably fair to say that you want to be getting into, as a starting point, hundreds of feet of 0.5 equivalent copper. The benefits of having polymetallic mineralization is that the different commodities essentially give you a hedge on individual price cycles. And so when we look at a hole 5, which is on our screen right now from 2011, I would volunteer that that's the starting point that you want to see for, if you're carrying that for hundreds of feet, and you look at the lateral scale of the sheeted veins that are mineralized at New Boston, in this case, a couple thousand meters, does that give you the copper equivalence, the polymetallic signature, and the grade and thickness to make you think New Boston could contribute to this push for new copper operations? And that would be my threshold for what's possible at New Boston as a starting point.
Yeah, and of course that hinges on the polymetallic nature of the system, as Mike said.
Yeah.
There is quite a bit of moly that we already know about in this system, and I think one of the important things we're seeing is these different porphyry phases and how they carry slightly different concentrations of these metals, at least visually so far. And like all three of these have rocketed up since January. I've seen, it's interesting to start thinking about what we traditionally needed to have in a copper moly porphyry system, say 5 years ago, and what might be required in the next 10 years as we see prices react to supply and demand. There's numerous people out there talking about $20,000-$30,000 copper. I'll wait and see for that one. But looking at the supply and demand as it is, you might actually see that threshold that Mike mentioned actually drop for a number of properties around the world, because there just simply isn't there aren't enough projects to drop the actually required of the green transition of these data centers, of all this new growth, especially in the US. So, but yeah, PNB 5C, we're starting hole 2 from. Those are some good grades. 100 ppm moly, 0.24 copper with 6 grams silver. You add that all together, you're in the 0.5 copper equivalent ballpark. I won't do any in the moment math.
0.5 copper equivalent, that is the bar that you guys need to reach to make this project work, and you need to prove it over a large enough scale. It seems like it definitely has the scale if you can show the grade. I mean, obviously Conoco put out a study based upon a handful of holes or something, and their total number, I won't even quote it because it's not compliant, was very large. It's very large. But yeah, so 0.5, that's our goal here. 0.5, if we're getting grades of 0.5 copper equivalent over good widths, we know we got something good. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And until next time.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Robert. It's great talking to you.
Cheers.